We gonna rise up till it's won.
So I want to start by asking, why did you come to DC, 30 plus years ago, and what do you think drew you to stay?
That is a great question. Well, the short answer is that when I graduated from college, I got one job offer,
I
and it
know
was.
that. I know that life. Yeah.
But there's more backstory to that. So it was. I actually came to DC this summer after my junior year in college as well, and it was at a point in my life where I decided that I wanted to, at least at that point, to just devote my energy to issues of equity. And so I came the summer after my junior year of college to work for a program called Higher Achievement, which had a summer program for middle school kids from low-income neighborhoods. I was at St. Augustine School, which allowed us to use the building. And then when I graduated, I came back to work for Higher Achievement as a full-time volunteer for a year. It turned into a 3-year stint. And it was just, and at that point I was up in Mount Pleasant at Sacred Heart School. And it was just super wonderful introduction to DC, super important exposure to me to being immersed in a low-income community and seeing all of the assets that were there, but also all the barriers that those children faced. And in a lot of ways, the work I continue to do to this day has those families in mind. Like, what do we do to help those wonderful families and those kids succeed? And why did I stay? I mean, I love DC. So I'm from the Midwest, a small town, and DC is just, I love the fact that it's a big city without being too big.
Mhm.
I love the fact that it has so much history in it. It was coming to DC was my first time to be really exposed in a majority Black community as well. And I really appreciate DC's history as a majority Black city. And I'm troubled. And part of the reason I'm running is that is not the case anymore. And the Black population continues to decline as it gets pushed out. And the fact that DC has its own culture, and it's driven a lot by Black people, go-go music and others, also been,
Go. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I actually, so you talked about part of your campaign being wanting to make DC a more equitable place. I was hoping we could dive into that a little more so we can just get a little bit more history about you. I would even go far enough from looking at your campaign website to say that your life mission in some ways is to make DC more equitable. Is there like a specific moment you could tell us about, maybe when you were there that first summer, where you knew, like, yes, this is why I want to be in DC, and this is why I want to make my mission to make DC a more equitable place, or maybe a relationship that you had?
It's true, my entire career in one way or another has been focused on issues of equity. When I left the Higher Achievement Program, I actually spent 10 years working on anti-poverty policy, but it was much more focused at the national level or in other states. And it was when my sons were little boys, so they're now 23 and 26, so a little more than 20 years ago. And I just started paying much more attention to the schools around me, the fact that there was a playground across the street from me that was in terrible shape. I remember actually at that point, our delegate to the Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, proposed that every DC resident get some sort of like tax credit for just living in DC. And I wrote an op-ed to the Post that got published that said, don't bribe me with that. Bribe me with good schools, nice playgrounds, good healthcare. Like, that's what I want. And it sort of made me realize that while I was spending time working with folks in other parts of the country to make their communities better, I wanted to make my community better. So it was at that point I said, that's when I really decided that I wanted to focus my energy on making DC a better place. And I started shopping myself around to a bunch of organizations. I just had lunch meetings with them. I said, don't you want to hire me? I could do research on poverty and help you make the case. And they're like, no.
Nothing.
But I got the opportunity when the DC Fiscal Policy Institute was created, and it's, I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but that was a life-changing experience. So it really was sometimes I like to say, for those who remember when the newspaper was in print, which I know maybe it was Sunrise.
I still get the newspaper in print.
All right. Well, what I say was, at that point, I went from reading the A section of the paper first to reading the B section first, right? When I really decided that Metro, even though Metro, coverage of the Post is pretty crappy now, that I really wanted to focus on my local community before I thought about national issues. And one of the beautiful things about working on policy in DC, sorry for just jumping in, is because we have a 13-member council, that's essentially our state legislature. It's not very big or complicated. Because we're a prosperous city and a progressive city, DC is just a place where you can get a lot of really good stuff done, like the Clean Energy DC Act that we'll talk about, like paid family leave, like a $15 minimum wage. So I really think one of the excitements about running for council is that I think DC can be a showcase for what, I don't want to even say progressive, because that's just like too generic a word and everyone calls themselves progressive, but really a community focused on equity and supporting everyone and supporting our planet can look like because of those dynamics.
Right. So yeah, you started talking about the topics. I think let's jump into it. I think that what we want to know and get a tangible grasp of is, what does it mean to you? What does equity mean to you? What does it mean for DC to be more equitable to you specifically? And so to give you all who are watching or listening a taste of what we're going to be talking about, as Ed mentioned, we'll be talking about climate change, about housing justice, about defund the police, and some miscellaneous questions if we get to it at the end. But yeah, so let's start with climate change. Climate change is a crisis we know very well here at Sunrise, that we're dealing with now, but the great thing is that there are policies that can make a difference. And so let's start with the Clean Energy DC Act. Can you start by telling us what it is and why you support it?
Sure. So I'll also just start by saying it had a predecessor as well, right? I mean, the Clean Energy DC Act sort of started when the campaign to create a carbon tax or carbon fee and rebate program was proposed. They put a price on it campaign, which is still a smart way, I think, to reduce carbon emissions. But the campaign had its effort. I supported it back in 2018, both when I was working at the Fiscal Policy Institute, but also when I ran for council back then. And it didn't pass, but it did morph into the Clean Energy DC Act, with primarily the goal of the city moving in a really, really aggressive way to 100% renewable energy. And I'm sorry if I'm getting the exact year wrong, but I think by 2032, which is not that far away. And it is assertive or aggressive, whatever the right word is. But obviously, the climate crisis is with us and already affecting our communities and disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. So policies that take multiple generations to get there, we just don't have that time. We've squandered it, unfortunately. So I really support all of its goals and the components of what it's going to take to get there. Getting buildings to be carbon neutral, certainly making new buildings all electric, and helping old buildings become more energy efficient and shift to clean energy, helping homeowners and residents do the same. The Solar for All goal of helping 100,000 low-income residents get solar energy, making sure that vehicles on the road are also switching to electric, including certainly starting with the things that the city can control, its own fleet. Let's just move in every single way possible to switch from carbon emitting, greenhouse gas emitting sources of energy to clean energy.
Right. And so can you tell us how you would go about implementing this once on the council, specifically the Clean Energy DC Act?
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying I have a lot of experience as an advocate with ambitious goals that are passed without necessarily having the commitment to actually implementing. So another example that comes to mind is that the council passed legislation 2 years ago, the Birth to Three for All in DC Act, to make childcare affordable to every single family in the city but specifically to make really high quality early childhood education accessible to every DC resident. And it passed unanimously, as I think the Clean Energy DC Act did as well. But it's stuck because there isn't the commitment to finding the resources to implement it. So I guess the thing that I bring to this is an advocacy like tenacity of, okay, we said we care about this, and not let the council members who voted for it and took credit for it at the time forget about the fact that they made that commitment. So continually reminding us, just as in a bully pulpit kind of way, that we made this obligation. There's an urgency to it, and we need to make progress on it. So there's probably a million different ways to do that, but certainly, attending rallies with Sunrise Movement and others, putting out press releases, doing events outside some Pepco place because a substation because Pepco isn't using clean energy, whatever it is, continue to bring public attention to it. And then working with advocates to be very specific on what we should be doing. What's the timetable for implementing it? What should the goals be for getting between now and 2032? Setting really, really concrete metrics. And that means fighting for the funding. That means really rigorous oversight in the council of the mayor to make sure that they're reporting on the progress they're making or the lack of their progress thereof. So I guess maybe I go back to the word tenacity. Like, it just requires somebody and somebodies on the council to say, we actually really care about it. It wasn't just a throwaway vote, and we are going to follow through with the oversight and with the funding and partnering with the community to figuring out the best way to implement. Because, even the best piece of legislation is still just a blueprint, and it needs the details to be fleshed out to make it reality.
Right. I really like the word tenacity that you use, because I think that, what I'm realizing is that even though someone can, or the council can vote on something and it gets passed, that doesn't mean that it is implemented as efficiently or all parts of it or expanded upon of when it was actually passed. So I think someone who's on top of it, who might even expand on it, who will bring different voices to the table to set goals, I think is really important.
And we'll need the tenacity of Sunrise and others as well, right? Because, one council member doing something alone, even with a couple of council members, but it's more like, all of the energy that we had this past summer around police brutality in the face of policymakers at their homes, thousands of people testifying, that's the kind of thing that puts pressure. And as someone who supports the goal, it doesn't put pressure, but it shows the community backing. So obviously I love Sunrise because you are tenacious and really,
definitely.
Ambitious, take no prisoner goals, and then fight for them. And so I know you're going to be there to help keep the heat up, so to speak.
Showing up for sure. I also want to, you briefly touched on transportation, but I want to make sure we highlight this because it's important as well. The transportation electrification program, which is exciting, and it should get its own spotlight. And would mandate that 100% of public buses, and you mentioned fleets, would be zero emission. I think it's by 2045. And so I just want to make sure we highlight that as well. And could you talk about how this worked? Would it be similar to the Clean Energy DC Act? Would it work in tandem?
Probably, one way or the other, we'll just get it done. So I don't know exactly whether it's in tandem or not. I read the Sierra Club, the story about the Sierra Club report saying, let's do this over the next 25 years because the electric fleet is so expensive. And, going back to the beginning part of the conversation, I don't know if we have time to wait 25 years, and maybe that's, I'm not being super realistic there, but that just seems to be letting policymakers off the hook. So certainly the district, as it's replacing its vehicles, should invest in electric vehicles. And even if we just did it through normal turnover, we would obviously turn over the entire fleet in more than 25 years. Because if we wait 25 years, that means obviously we're still buying gas-powered, diesel-powered buses and cars for some period of time. For Metro, it's not, the city doesn't have the direct control, but we certainly should be pushing them to do it as well. And, to get budget wonky on you, what I read is the electric vehicles are more expensive up front, but save money over time, which is a lot like solar energy, right? There's this initial upfront cost, but it saves you money over time. And we found very creative ways to finance solar. I guess I don't know why we don't find creative ways to help cities finance electric fleets, knowing that there'll be a payoff down the road so that we can move faster. So I don't really know much about it, but it's something that I would love to figure out if there is a strategy for us to find the way to finance moving to all electric fleet and buses way sooner than 2045.
Definitely. And I want to ask a little bit about your background with climate change. You touched on the DC fiscal policy a little bit, but can you talk more about how you've championed climate change there as well as maybe elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, my professional energy has been focused at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute that I ran from 2001 until 2020, just stepping down to run for office, and it's very much focused on issues of economic inequity. So housing and healthcare and schools, and climate is not a direct part of its work. But I have, through that work, supported programs to help particularly low-income families weatherize their homes, to help them save on energy, and of course help save the planet as well. I was part of the Solar for All advisory committee to help figure out a way to start implementing that program. And over just the past 2 years, had a very interesting project that started and is still moving on, maybe still a little bit of an infancy, but a partnership with the Department of the Energy and Environment, Empower DC, DC Solar United, and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute to sort of inform the way the city could move towards 100% renewable energy, but also do it with the issue of racial equity in mind first, so that it's done in tandem with that, as opposed to an afterthought. And we just started the project a little more than a year ago, and mostly focused on engaging community input at that point on what that would mean for the community. And the project continues, but I'm, of course, no longer at the Fiscal Policy Institute. So it's not part of my work there. But in my personal life, I just in general try to keep my own personal footprint in this world as limited as possible, and just try to be efficient with what I use. And we compost in my backyard. I started a recycling program in my office building in the 1980s when there wasn't one, and when recycling wasn't mandated in DC. We have a hybrid vehicle, not electric yet, but at some point maybe we'll be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing about your background in climate and what your plans are to enforce policies that would help make our world better, and help make DC specifically better. I want to hop to our next topic, which is housing justice, which I know you've worked on. And the way that I was thinking we could talk about this is sort of two frameworks. As we know, DC has had a long history of housing crisis that was pre-COVID, during COVID, as well as will be there post-COVID. But we also know that there is an eviction crisis happening right now due to COVID. So I want to keep those two things in mind. And before we jump into talking about policy, I would like us all to be on the same page about terminology. So if you could define these for us, we want to understand the difference between the current rent moratorium, cancel rent, and rent control.
Yeah, those are great questions. So, and I'll just start by saying, I think every one of us knows the role that our house plays in our lives, right? To have that key in your pocket at the end of a stressful day, to be able to open the door, close it behind you, and lock, and feel safe, secure, do a sigh of relief, I'm home, right? And that kind of stability is important to everyone. And when you don't have that stability, really it's hard for anything else in your life to be successful. And that's why housing is so important to me. We can't expect kids to succeed in school, or people to be able to keep their job, or even support their mental health if their housing is unstable. And that is why I am so worried, as you are obviously as well, that so many families have not been able to pay rent. and they know they're okay for now, but they must be worried, every day about, what's going to happen when this moratorium ends? Because the way the moratorium works is nobody can be evicted while the moratorium is happening. So you can't pay rent because you lost your job, you're fine, you won't be evicted. However, that unpaid rent bill is piling up. Your landlord is tabulating that, and as soon as the mayor declares the pandemic emergency to be over, which could be as early as this month, 60 days after that, landlords could start demanding rent and start the eviction process. And of course, we know that most renters didn't have a lot of money in savings before the pandemic started, and then they lost their jobs through no fault of their own. The economy was shut down around them, and their income disappeared. So the notion that even if you get your job back, which is, of course, kind of cross your fingers, that you'd be able to pay your back rent is for most people just not possible. So yeah, so thousands and thousands of families are facing eviction, and the cancel rent goal is to say that we should not accept eviction as an outcome of a pandemic, right? We should not let eviction compound the economic and health crisis of the pandemic. And cancel rent can mean a bunch of things. One of it is just literally nobody has to pay rent during the pandemic because of the pandemic. I think that's a fine goal, particularly if we can find a way to subsidize the income of people to pay the rent directly to landlords. So I'd love to have the federal government pay to cancel rent. Unfortunately, with this Congress, they're not able to pass a relief package that expired at the end of July. Of course, shameful. I'm not counting on that. So cancel rent also can mean specifically your rent is canceled if you lost your job and you can show you didn't have the income. So it's essentially an eviction ban for anybody who lost their job. And that means that you would never owe that back rent, right? That you could never be evicted if you lost your job during the pandemic and couldn't pay your rent, even if ultimately you come back to being able to pay rent when you get your job back, like next year, for example. No one could ever say, hey, you didn't pay rent in July 2020, we're going to evict you. We would just ban it. We would cancel the rent for that period. That probably also requires a little bit of backup to make sure that landlords, particularly small landlords, don't go out of business and have the resources they need to maintain their buildings. But landlords probably have to feel some of the pain in the pandemic as well. So we're all suffering, and landlords, unfortunately, are just part of that process, but should be as well. The pain should be spread. And rent control is like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, super important issue of keeping housing stable for every single renter, the folks who are not or choose not to buy a house. So rather than letting people be subject to the whims of the market, and we all know if you've been in DC how crazy the market is and how rents keep rising, rent control says, landlords, it's in the public interest to keep rents affordable and reasonable, so you can only limit rents by a certain amount. And we have rent control, we've had it for a long time, but what we have is just very, very weak and getting weaker every year. So for example, in DC, the only buildings covered by rent control are those that are 45 years old or older. All the new stuff that you see is not covered by rent control and never will be, which means those landlords can raise rents by whatever amount they want at any time they want. And obviously that is not supporting stability. So the Reclaim Rent Control platform that I support says new buildings up to their first 15 years, charge whatever rent you want, give you some time to get your building established. But after 15 years, rent control kicks in and you can only raise rents with inflation every year. I won't go, we can talk more about it if you want, but there are other elements of the current rent control law that allow unscrupulous landlords to basically get out from underneath rent control requirements. And we just need to close those loopholes so that if you're in your apartment and your building's more than 15 years old, you know that your rent's not going to go up by more than inflation every year.
Yeah, two questions that I have. One is you talked about an eviction ban, and I'm wondering what is, eventually people are going to be facing evictions soon. And what is your plan to make sure that evictions don't happen? I don't know if you wanted to add anything to the eviction ban.
Yeah, no, I guess I guess what I would just say is if we don't want evictions, we just sort of set our goal and then we legislate into it. So if we don't want evictions, then we just literally ban eviction. So I would be ready to introduce January 2021 a piece of legislation that says if you got behind on your rent last year, 2020, because your job disappeared in the pandemic, no landlord can evict you, right? So you could not, a landlord would just not be allowed to start the eviction process for someone who had lost their income. So it's just that's what banning evictions means to me. And it's permanent, meaning the landlord could never, ever come for that back rent because your income disappeared and there's no way you're ever going to get it back.
And do you believe in banning evictions even beyond COVID?
I mean, the thing that I love about movements like Sunrise and are the vision of just a nicer world, and then figuring out a way to get there. So I honestly, before this campaign and before the pandemic, hadn't thought about it. But eviction obviously is horribly traumatic. We talked about housing being the source of stability. Eviction is the complete opposite of that. It's complete instability, and it's downward spiral. It's awful on children. That's a long way to say I love the vision of a world with no evictions. Period. Where we just don't have them at all.
Period. No evictions. Period.
No evictions. Yeah,
Yep.
and let's figure out a way to get there, because obviously there's some devil in the details there. But yeah, if we say that a wave of evictions in the pandemic would be awful, why would it be okay at some point to then come back and say, all right, evictions right now, pandemic's over, let's get them rolling.
Yeah, 100%. We at Sunrise, we love that vision, and like, yes, let's do that. And so also, you did touch on rent control, and we're going into it a bit.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk more broadly about how you would want to make housing more affordable in DC, rent control included.
Yeah. So there's just so much to say. I mean, I do think it does start with a really strong rent control program that says to landlords, you can make money off your buildings, but you can't make excess profits because more people want to live in DC, and you can suddenly start charging more rent. So the rent control platform is pretty tight, right? Rents can't grow more than inflation. When a unit becomes vacant, the landlord can't raise the rent. Any building with 4 units or more would be covered that's at least 15 years old. So it would just greatly expand the universe, but all in the interest of protecting tenants. So that's an important part. Rent control isn't necessarily affordable housing though, right? Because let's say you build a brand new building and the rents are $3,000 a month for a 1-bedroom, 15 years from now, that's going to be under rent control, but it isn't necessarily affordable. It helps the person in that unit maintain it, assuming their income, may not be going up, but it's not quote unquote affordable housing. So the other step is, what do we do to make sure that literally housing fits within the budget of every single family, regardless of your income? And I do think that starts right now with just the city upping its investment in affordable housing. So housing right now is 3% of the city's budget. And I don't think that anybody listening to this or watching this who would say housing is 3% of the city's problems. I know we're going to touch on police in a minute. We spend twice as much on policing in DC, just the police department, as we spend on affordable housing. So part of what we just need to do is up our game to really make a commitment to affordable housing. Just like a vision of having no evictions, let's have a vision of enough affordable housing in the city for everybody. And that means building more affordable housing through the programs that build it. It means subsidizing people to help pay their rent if they're in an apartment that's unaffordable. It means using DC-owned land to create housing that's permanently affordable. There are other tools as well, though, I think that are more visionary that I would love the city to move towards. One is the idea of a community land trust that some of y'all may be familiar with, but the idea there is that land that is held in trust, either by the government or like a nonprofit organization, which means that there's no private money-making entity that's ever going to control that land. And at that point, you don't have to worry about rents rising because there's no profit motive anymore. So a land trust is a way to tie up land, particularly in parts of the town where development is coming, and help build housing on it that can be affordable literally forever. We have one, I believe, land trust in the city that's privately a nonprofit, the Douglas Land Trust. There's no city-funded land trust, so we should do that. And then the other new form of housing and it's both concept and sort of specific program, is known as social housing. in other parts of the world, the government doesn't just subsidize like public housing and a small part of the housing stock. They actually manage and control a very large share of the housing market, specifically for the goal of creating housing stability and housing affordability. We don't do that here. So social housing means the city would help invest in, whether it's it directly constructing or through nonprofits, housing at a range of income levels, but with the goal of it being permanently affordable and not allowing rents to rise there. Social housing also envisions that the people who live in the housing have a say in their housing, including, even in the early stages as the housing's being planned, the people who are going to live there, but also, democratic issues around how the building is operated and maintained. And
yeah,
if elected, to have my first term focus on let's fund our first social housing project in the District of Columbia and see if we can go even further than that.
Yeah, I wish we had more time because I want to get into the details. I have more questions. I'm going to keep going though.
All right.
We have more time at the end to get down and more into the nitty gritty. We're going to jump to our next topic of defund the police. So we know that George Floyd's death was a breaking point for the country, and we were reminded of what we already knew all too well, which is that police do not value Black lives, right? And so before we jump into this topic, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge how much pain and suffering is built into the demand of defund the police. So I want to start this topic by asking a little bit of a more personal question, which is, have you ever experienced fear or violence from the police, either for yourself or for any loved ones?
Yeah. So I have. I guess I'll just in general say, whenever a police officer is near me, it does not make me feel more comfortable. It just tends to make me feel nervous, right?
Yeah.
And I will not say that I've been a victim of severe police brutality, but I did have a moment a long time ago when a police officer stopped me. I had a plastic cover on my license plate because at the time your registration sticker in DC was stuck on your license plate, and people who didn't want to buy a new registration sticker would just take yours. It was a hustle back then.
Yeah, I respect the hustle.
So I covered it up with a piece of plastic, and the plastic had gotten a little faded. And the police officer stopped me and accused me of trying to evade radar with this plastic cover. And I explained what I was. I'm a mild-mannered guy. I'm a white guy, that thought that I'm somehow this awful criminal. And he said, "You have to take that off right now." And I was like, "Okay, I don't have a screwdriver." And he's like, "You have to take it off right now." And then I even saw that the bolts were rusty. He's like, "You have to take it off right now, or I'm going to give you a $500 ticket." And he just forced me to rip this plastic off in this really dehumanizing kind of way, when he knew I wasn't doing anything wrong. He could have just said, "Go home and take care of it, please." And I would have. And that I went through that small moment of, shame and being terrorized by the police officer is obviously pales in comparison to obviously so many other things that we've paid attention to that we know happen all the time and that have gotten so much attention this year.
Right.
I'll say, I married a Black woman, and so I raised 2 Black sons. And so I didn't personally have that conversation about this is what you do with the police, because it's not really my personal experience, but we do have that conversation in our house. And I just know that the other people that I live with, when they leave the home, feel much less safe and secure just walking outside than I do. And I recognize that is in part the world we live in, and in part because the police can do anything at any moment.
Right. Thank you for sharing that experience with us. And so we know that defund the police has gained a lot of traction. What does the policy of defund the police mean to you, and what do you think it could mean for DC specifically?
Yeah, well, I really do love how for the most part, when people talk about defund the police, it's defund the police and reinvest in the community, because they really do go hand in hand, right? It's both a recognition that traditional policing targets Black and brown people through its racist history, and just the racism built into white America, that it often escalates rather than de-escalates. It treats, fellow neighbors as the enemy rather than people to support, and ultimately creates more harm. And certainly that's Breonna Taylor's story. It's also Deon Kay's story, right? Because he had a gun, but he wasn't using it at the moment. And the police knew about it only by tracking him on social media. So they didn't confront him in person. They knew he had a gun, chased him down, got out of their car and shot him within seconds, rather than like figuring out what's a peaceful way to get this gun off the street, right? So the thought that an 18-year-old is dead because an officer made this awful decision about how to try to get one gun off the street is why we need to do something different. So part of the defund message is policing is not the right approach to public safety, and therefore we need to greatly scale back. And I certainly love the vision of abolishing police, a world where we don't have police at all. But certainly in the short term, it means greatly reducing the number of police officers we have. And even from a budget perspective, DC has more police per capita and more spending per capita than any major US city. So even if we just went down to the average of other cities, we would cut a lot. And I'm digressing a little bit, but I don't know about you. I noticed that even for very routine things, like somebody seems to be stopped because they went through a stop sign or something, that there'll be 3 police cars that show up. I'm like, that's clearly a sign that we have too many police, or at least it seems to me to be a sign that we have too many police. So yes, greatly reducing our police force, militarizing them, right? I mean, when you see police, they just look so menacing. Obviously rubber bullets and tear gas and all those implements, like let's take away the most serious military kind of weaponry of our police is another part of it. Let's take away those responsibilities that police don't want at all, like dealing with mental health crises on the street, and find other ways to deal with it. I mean, the fact that Philando Castile was stopped for a traffic issue by an armed police officer was what led to him losing his life, when if it had just been a traffic officer who was unarmed, he would still be around, right? So that's certainly the other half. And then the question is like, well, what's the better way to create safety? And certainly what's the better way to save the money if it's not going into police? And I think we all know that public safety is about communities and people who feel safe and stable. So investing in affordable housing, investing in more adequate incomes, mental health services, jobs, right? I mean, you ask why do young boys in Ward 7 and Ward 8 have guns, and white teenagers in Ward 3 don't? It's not that one set of kids are good and one set of kids are bad. Obviously, it's the environment. So we just need to improve those environments. So let's reinvest in all the things that we know make people more stable and their communities more stable.
Right. It's about investing in what makes those people feel safe, right? Yeah. And what will make them thrive ultimately.
Yeah.
Right. So
you asked what's possible in DC as well? Is that?
Yeah. If we could talk about what it would sort of look like in practice.
Yeah. Well, I just had my first conversation with someone, with a group of people about this last weekend, I think, and I do think it's a beautiful vision. And then the question is like, how do you get the mechanics? So I do think it starts by trying to get a commitment from our leaders, put the mayor on record, as well as Charles Allen, who's the head of the committee, and every other council member to say, do you support greatly reducing the size of our police force, greatly reducing our investment in policing and shifting to community investment, even something as vague as that, just to get them on the record, because we all know 15,000 people testified this past summer, and the council barely nicked the MPD budget. So there's so much more that needs to be done. And then I think we need to dig into, well, where does the police department spend its money? What are the current contract obligations and that limits based on that? And start coming up with a plan of, we think over the next year we can reduce the police force by X. We can reduce investment in these other parts of the police department by Y, and just come up with a plan that, with maybe a goal of 4 years from now, we want the police to be reduced by whatever the number might be, and come up with those specific plans. And so it requires gathering a lot of information about what we're spending on policing right now, so that we can make a plan for where and when we can start cutting back.
Where you want to make those cuts, and where you'd like to invest.
Because it won't work if we just say, let's reduce the police budget by $100 million next year. Or I wouldn't say it won't work, but it's not as effective, because unfortunately, I think the policymakers can come back and say, well, how would you do that? And if we on the, those on the advocacy side don't have an answer, it's just the advocacy isn't as powerful as if you say, we know you actually can cut 100 million if you did these 5 things.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and here's where we plan to put it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you for your insight on what we could do in DC to defund the police. Unfortunately, we're coming up on 45 minutes now. I think what I'm going to do is wrap up and ask a concluding question. And then for those people who still want to either listen or watch after that, I have one more sort of miscellaneous question. So our concluding question that we have for you is really about like imagining you on the council. So imagine it's 2021, you're in the council seat. You'll be
sitting next to Janice Lewis George.
Yes. You'll be working with Silverman, your former colleague, Robert White, who you're also voting for, and other council members. To end the interview, could you talk more about how to work with these members to pass progressive policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I have found in the past is that policymakers in general want to do good, that more specifically, they want to do things that their constituents like because they are thinking about re-election. And they want, therefore, to be able to take credit for things that they've done, legislation they've passed, budgets they've passed. And my goal is just to steer them in the right direction and say, hey, let's take credit for the right thing and not necessarily the wrong thing. And given that we are largely a progressive city, I do think that's possible. As an advocate, I've always done the same thing that Sunrise does, is just set that vision of like, wouldn't it be great if we had a world where we didn't need police to keep us safe and we were investing in just, healthy families and healthy communities? Or wouldn't it be great if we had a city where we didn't have anybody who slept in a tent because they didn't have a home, and things that hopefully nobody will disagree with. And then once you've gotten to that commitment, then you say, well, let's figure out a plan to get there, and you try to break it up so doesn't seem radical and extreme and requiring steps overnight, so that we can then do something to hold us accountable. Now that's like a little bit dreamy and a little bit Pollyannish, but I do think it's a starting point, and you can see how far that gets you. And then honestly, once you've set that vision and you have those goals, the folks who aren't on board with you, the folks who aren't coming along, then you just start making it clear that they just don't buy into this wonderful vision, right? That they are not the right people anymore. So if they're saying, oh, we can't raise taxes on our wealthiest people to end homelessness, then it's like, all right, well, let's make sure the voters understand that that's exactly what you just said, so that over time we are able to elect more people who have that right vision. So I guess I'm not afraid. I built coalitions, through the council. Everything that I've done as an advocate required 7 votes on the council. So I figured out ways to count those votes and compromise and all that sort of stuff. But I'm also very eager for a fight on these systemic issues, if it has to come to that, in a way that shows who is not really ready for bold systemic change, so that we can isolate them and ultimately remove them from office as well.
Ed is taking no prisoners. Okay, that's what we like to hear.
But we keep coming back.